Hey fearsome friends, I hope you're all well. Tonight the kidnappers are out in force, so keep your kids safely inside. Big hugs and kisses to you all for supporting my channel. Although I can see that 50% of my listeners haven't subscribed yet. Please push that button and make me do big smiles. And now, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I was living in Abu Dhabi when this happened, and I was 17 years old at the time. I've had a number of experiences from taxi drivers out there, but this one was by far the worst and creepiest, and I'd like to share it with you all. It was Boxing Day 2012, and I was going to my friend's house for his Boxing Day party. He lived in a compound that was a bit of a drive off the island itself, and although not a rural suburb by most standards, this area could be classed as such. These residential suburbs were also still mostly in development. Every block had a new building site, plenty of empty shells of houses, and no security cameras, etc. There were no pavements either, just rubble, sand patches split by tarmac roads. Now taxis in the UAE are very common. You just put your hand out and one pulls up. And back then there was less security. There were no cameras or mics in the car, just a meter. I hailed the cab and sat in front, as a result of a past experience I had, and we set out on our way. Things started out normally. We talked as I would usually do getting into a cab. How long have you lived here? Do you enjoy the place, etc. And when we're eventually on the highway, after we've crossed the water to the mainland, he pulled over on the hard shoulder, and without saying a word to me, pulled out his phone and called someone. He was speaking in his native tongue, and he is of South Asian descent, so I had no clue what he was saying. But I asked him politely to continue driving, as the meter was still on. He nodded, hung up and got going again. But this happened a second time, again without word or warning, and now I'm getting suspicious. This time I asked him again to keep going, but he ignored me and kept talking on the phone. We were on the highway. I couldn't get out for fear of going splat, not being able to hail a cab or being jacked for jaywalking. After a few minutes he got going again and we pulled off the highway, still heading into the direction I needed to be. We reached the first roundabout where we needed to make a right turn, but he went straight over. Now everyone knows where this compound is. It's the biggest one in the city. And as a cab driver, there's no chance he doesn't know how to get there. So now I'm even more suspicious, and I kind of have a feeling of trepidation, like I know this vibe and what might be happening. I asked him to turn around at the next roundabout, but he ignored me. Now I'm getting agitated and angry, and I asked him to just stop the car and I'll get out and walk. But no, he literally just ignored me and kept focusing on the road. At this point I was shouting at him, numerous expletives, etc., and it was clear that he'd got something else planned. Eventually he pulled off the main road onto a dirt track that led a couple of 100 yards into a massive building site and kept driving down it. He then turned to me and told me to get into the back seat, and repeated this in an increasingly forceful manner, to the point where we were shouting at each other. At the end of the dirt track was an old little minibus, with roughly 5 dudes stood next to it. I didn't notice this immediately. All that I cared about was that the car had stopped, and I was in the front so I could get out, as I'm not locked in. Inexplicably I threw some money at him, and jumped out of the car with my bag, and started walking away, jogging back down the track. I can only imagine that the earlier phone calls he had made were to these minibus men, as when I started getting away, they jumped in the minibus and drove down to catch me, as the taxi turned around and did the same. They all pulled up in front of me, like police do in the movies when they stop a bank robber and jump out. The taxi driver ran right up to me, grabbed me and screamed point blank at my face to get in the bus. I could still smell and feel the damp heat from his breath as it touched my face, and the little bits of his spit hitting my cheeks. This honestly just enraged me, so I grabbed him by the throat and pushed him against his car, screamed something back at him that I can't remember. Then I let go. They all got their phones out and started calling and messaging and moving towards me, so I just got out of there as fast as I could, ran all the way down and back onto the main road, and went to my mates on foot. I know I should have taken the number plate, ID number, etc. Called the police even when I was in the cab, let alone after it happened. However, I was a 17-year-old with a bottle of Jack Daniels in my bag, on the way to a party with all my mates drinking, in a Muslim country with a drinking age of 21. The paranoia of the trouble from that was enough to keep it quiet from the authorities, although I did tell every family member and friend. The year was 1994, and my dad had died in a boating accident that spring, and the story I'm about to tell you happened after the accident. So one day my mom and I were alone walking along the seawall to the local Civic Centre. I have a brother, but I think he had moved out at this time. So being during the day, there were quite a few people around, and it was a beautiful day to be out. But after walking for a while, we noticed these two hillbilly toothless guys were following us. Their hair was stringy and their clothes were dirty. And now that I'm much older and more experienced, I would say that they had probably been up for a couple of days. At first we didn't really think anything of it, as all kinds of people would drive their vehicles around the circle of the Civic Centre. But after a while, we noticed that they kept slowing down by where we were walking and were staring and ogling us. We decided to leave and go to a store, then make our way back to the Civic Centre. We figured that they would be gone by then. Now the Civic Centre is 2 stories high, so we walked around a little bit and then went up to the 2nd floor. We were pointing out sights that we could see around the area, when one of us happened to look down, where we could see the 2 men from before, looking up at us, and they were laughing. My mum and I took off running, and we ran into the Civic Centre. We'd created quite the scene, not just because we were running through the Civic Centre, but because we were the only white people in the middle of the Black Heritage Festival that was happening inside. As we were running along, we spotted a police officer, and we ran up to him. After we'd told him what was going on, he said he'd walk us to our car so we could get home. But when we exited the building, we could see that the creeper guys had parked by our vehicle and they were leaning on our car. The cop said to just get in and leave, and he'd take care of them. So we did just that. The cop went up to the 2 guys and called them away, and we got in our car and left. On the way home, we were constantly checking behind us to make sure nobody was following us, and although we lived about 30 minutes from the Civic Centre and out in the country, we pushed all the furniture in front of our doors, even though we knew that no one had followed us home. I don't know what their intentions were, but it genuinely felt like they were going to try and take us. So currently I'm 17, and this happened when I was 7, and I'd nearly forgotten about it. I'm also pretty overweight, and look mature for my age. So I guess, even though I browsed this subreddit a lot, having a dangerous encounter was never on my mind. I used to live in this nice apartment complex in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. It was just me, my mum, and my younger brother. He was 5 at the time. And it was a pretty safe and rich neighborhood, so we didn't expect anything bad to happen. However, one summer's day, me and my little brother were outside our apartment building, playing on the sidewalk, and our mum was inside, but she came out every 10 minutes to check on us. So we were outside playing, when this pale blue car pulled up next to us, and inside was a man. He seemed normal enough, maybe in his 40s, with a mustache and wearing a flannel shirt. He told us his puppy had gone missing and that he needed help finding him. So, and this is really stupid because when I was a kid, everyone called me mature and smarter for my age group, I walked up to him and said, "Sure, I can help you find him." My little brother overheard this and said, "I want to look too." So our dumb little asses waddled up to this man's car, when just then my mum came out, saw us walking up to this man, and yelled, "Hey, what's going on?" Now my mother takes no crap. She's kind and polite to just about everyone, but as soon as she feels that something is off, or someone is messing with her, me, or my brother, she gets vicious. I told her, "It's okay, Mum. He just needs help finding his dog." She only looked at me for half a second, already knowing that it was nonsense. What grown man would ask a little boy to help him find a dog? She looked him in the eye and asked, "What's your dog's name?" Immediately this man peeled out as fast as he could, and my mum grabbed us inside to play for the rest of the day. I'd brushed it off over the years, but now I know how dangerous that situation was, and I'm lucky that my mum was out in time to stop us. I grew up in a big house that was on the corner of a quiet street, right in front of a 5-star retirement home. On the other side of the street, in between all the big beautiful houses, was a small old house with wood covering all the windows. Now if you didn't live on my street, you'd think nobody lived in that sketchy little house. Throughout the day, random cars would pull into the back of the house where they couldn't be seen, and I'd see men walk in and out of it, and sometimes they'd sit on the front porch and drink and smoke. Around 9:30 each evening, the nurse caregiver shifts would change in the retirement home, and in front of my house was a bus stop where all the employees would wait for the bus or for their rides. It was approximately 10 p.m. on a warm night in June. I was in my basement, and I had the windows cracked open. I was at home with my mum and 3 sisters, when I heard screaming from outside. My sisters heard it as well, so we went to the windows to have a look, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But what we did see was a woman running around 3 cars in our driveway, and we assumed someone was breaking into one of our cars. So we turned on the outside lights and spotted a woman screaming, "Help me," and running around the cars, and she was being chased by 2 men. We got scared and ran inside to our mum. My sisters and I were young teens at the time and too scared to go outside. The screaming continued for a few minutes, and I saw the men grab the woman and tried pushing her into the trunk of their SUV. She was trying hard to fight and resist though. At that exact moment my dad was arriving home and noticed a black Jeep with its trunk open, blocking the street. He flashed his lights and honked at them, not knowing what was going on. The kidnappers thought someone had spotted what they were doing and immediately threw the woman on the ground, got in their car and drove off. My dad parked his car and found the woman on the ground. She was crying so much, and she kept thanking my dad. As my dad had connected the dots and realized he'd stopped her from getting thrown into a van, he looked around and saw a few men standing outside the sketchy house and realized they were watching the whole kidnapping happen without interfering. He invited the woman into our home and called the police. She was a 55-year-old nurse, and she told us she waits outside our home for her son to pick her up every day. She was so thankful for my dad, and when the police arrived they took statements and gathered the kidnappers' fingerprints from our cars, since they were running around them and touching them as they did. My dad told the police he'd suspected the men at the sketchy house could potentially have been involved, so the police walked over there to question them. Bad idea. After the cops left that night, a man walked over to our house and said to my dad, "You made a mistake by saying something to the police." And since that day, any time I went outside to play, they'd be staring at me. And if I walked home from school, they'd begin to walk after me. They were so creepy and scary. Eventually the cops busted the house for other illegal activity. They drilled the doors shut and I never saw anyone there again. I did see the 55-year-old nurse sometimes as she got off of work. She now works the earlier day shift, and she always waves at us as she walks by. So I think about this event probably at least once a month, and it took place when I was in the 8th or 9th grade at the age of 13. I'm now 29. It was December, and schools were having a half day for holiday break. That meant we got out at noon instead of 3:30. My brother, 3 years older than me, so roughly 15 to 16, was set to watch a family friend's pets while they were on vacation. They only lived down the street and around a corner, and he had his permit, but for whatever reason, he walked to their house and my mum instructed my sister, a year younger than my brother, to drive the car down to him so he'd have it to come back with, and I was to ride my electric scooter there and bring her back. So I was doing laps in my driveway and street, waiting for my sister to come outside, when I noticed a red minivan go by our corner house. I didn't think anything of it, just noticed it. My sister then came out, started the car, and we went on our way. As we got across the street, I noticed the red minivan reversing out of my neighbour's driveway. Again, thought no biggie, probably missed their turn. And being young and dumb, she was holding onto my arm out of the car window to make me go faster on my scooter, when she said, "Hey, gotta go, there's a car behind me," and proceeded to go the speed limit to get out of the car's way. I continued scootering along. As I was nearing the cul-de-sac, I heard a man shouting at me. I stopped and turned around, and the red minivan was parked horizontally in the road, almost completely blocking the entrance and exit of the cul-de-sac. I was maybe 20 feet from him and was trying to figure out if he was someone's dad that I knew. He was waving me over, and I was just about to go to him, when my sister called me from the driveway of our friend's home. Now mind you, I'd been through the stranger danger crap, but no red flags were going up. Idiot. Anyway, I luckily went to my sister. She hopped onto my lap and we scooted past the minivan, having to swerve to get by it. The van proceeded to follow us almost all the way home, which I wasn't aware of, until it passed us at the stop sign for the street we needed to cross and then be home. Mum asked us how the drop-off went, and I casually mentioned the van and she freaked out, dragged both of us into the car and started hunting this dude and his minivan down. My mum was one mama bear you didn't want to mess with. So as she was driving through all the intertwined neighbourhoods, who do we see approaching us from the other side of the road? You guessed it, the red minivan dude. I screamed and pointed like a dumbass that was him, and he clearly saw me in the front seat and proceeded to floor it down the street. Well, my mum learned to drive in the streets of New York City, so she took off after this guy. He was doing everything he could to lose us, including driving into a CVS parking lot, flying around the building and going back into the neighbourhoods with my mum hot on his trails. 911 told us to stop following him after we gave the description and the license plate, as he could be dangerous, so she followed their directions and stopped pursuing. As we were heading home, we came across a house with 3 boys playing in the front yard, about my age or maybe a year younger. And guess who was reversing out of the neighbourhood's driveway and turning back in the direction of these boys? Yup, the red minivan guy. He saw us, stopped his car, and my mum stopped her car, and we had an intense stare down of maybe 20 seconds. Then he floored it down the street to his right and disappeared. My mum put the van in park, told us to lock the doors, and ran screaming up to the boys to get inside. She told the mother of the household what was going on, and we relayed the information to the cops assigned to the situation. The cops did nothing at all though, because no crime had actually been committed. However, we had a cop friend due to my softball playing. His daughter played on my team, who straight up told us the address and the people that lived there. It turns out it was an elderly couple van, but they had had a son in the age range of the guy we all saw driving the van, early 30ish. Less than a month later, that van was no longer at the residence, sold to whoever. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if it was his desire, ransom, to sell kids, murder them, etc. But he was up to no good, and my damn radar was not going off until my mum freaked out. I thank goodness that my sister called over to me when she did, because I was about to go over to this man, thinking he was someone's dad that I knew through softball. I always wonder if he ended up getting caught, or if any kids fell victim to him. And again, this is over a decade later. He knew children were out early from school, and most might not have a parental figure at home watching them due to the half day at school. He wanted something sinister, and nobody can change my mind. For reference, we live in a state infamous for human trafficking, and the event took place around 2 a.m. So my friend and I, both females, were driving down a road in the middle of nowhere, just talking and clearing our minds. You know those roads out in the desert that stretch for miles with no lights, that get pitch black and a little spooky at night. It was one of those. So we were already a little paranoid, given that we are both small females late at night in the middle of nowhere. If anything were to happen, no one would be around to see it. After about 15 minutes of driving out into this area, without passing by a single vehicle, a black, either very large truck or SUV, I can't really remember despite it only being a couple of days ago, came up in the distance. They had their high beams on, so they could have seen that we were two females alone as they passed us, and immediately after passing us, they pulled off and stopped for a second, which alarmed us a bit, and then pulled a U-turn, driving in our direction, which alarmed us a little bit more. The street was just a long stretch of straight road continuing for miles, and there was no logical reason for them to have turned around, as based on the layout of the land, this is not the kind of place you can take a wrong turn. But regardless, if you are suspicious, it gets worse. They sped up until they were directly behind us, blinding us with their lights, which scared us even more. Then the next move made our stomachs drop and our breathing stop. They turned their lights off so we couldn't see them anymore, aside from the brief shadow of a vehicle if I really squinted into the dark. To say we were terrified was an understatement. All of the worst case scenarios were playing out in our heads. We had never been in this area before, and we were alone. We didn't want to call the cops, as they were notoriously unreliable. We were in the middle of nowhere, and we had weed in the car. But despite this, we felt safe knowing that even though unreliable, we were in a vehicle. As long as we didn't stop or get out, we would be safe. And so we did just that. For 30 minutes, but what felt like an eternity, this vehicle followed us with its lights off, and we never passed by a single other vehicle on the road. After driving back to civilization, finding a route that had no U-turns required, despite how much longer it would take, the vehicle let off once there were streetlights and buildings in sight. What could have happened? What were their possible intentions? Is there any way that we were just being dramatic, and their intentions were not malicious? I would like to know if there's at least a possibility of that, as to feel safe driving out in that direction again, should I need to. When I was 16 years old, I decided to surprise my parents with a bouquet of flowers for Valentine's Day as we've always celebrated this as a family holiday rather than a romantic one. I didn't have a car to drive to the florist, but my high school was within walking distance of a hospital, boasting a gift shop that sold floral arrangements. So between classes during the week of Valentine's Day, I set off for the hospital by my lonesome, cutting across campus to walk through a network of side roads populated with specialty doctors' offices that keep odd hours, and the sort of buildings where travelling doctors mainly hold surgery consultations or perform small procedures a few times a month. The trip there passed without incident, but as I was walking back through said deserted roads with a vase of flowers in tow, I noticed an unkempt 1990s car close behind me. Now, while my memory of the car is hazy, I am left with the impression that there were at least 2 men within whose faces I couldn't see. Initially, I assumed that the driver was simply afraid of hitting me, which was the reason they weren't passing by. So I made a point of dramatically trudging further into the grassy shoulder of the road, demonstrating to them that they could safely drive ahead. But they still refused to pass me by, continuing to creep along behind at a slow pace. Beginning to now suspect that the driver was more interested in me than a destination, I began to walk faster. The car confirmed my suspicions by matching my speed, despite the impracticality of my shoes and the threat of spilling water from my vase. I commenced to run as fast as I possibly could, and they hit the gas and again matched my speed. I realized at this point that the car was following me, that there was no one in sight to notice, and I needed to get away. I bolted into the first parking lot that I saw, and the car turned in after me. Despite there being only 2 or 3 cars in the spacious front parking lot, and there being no other sign of activity at the office, this car did not stop to park in the numerous spaces available there. The driver instead opted to pursue me into the partially under-constructed back portion of this lot, behind the office. It passed every available parking space to corner me against a pile of debris and rubble from the construction, coming to a diagonal stop less than 3 feet away. Before anyone could emerge from the vehicle, I somehow managed to scale the small prominence of rubble against my back, vase in hand, and jumped from its peak to land painfully on the other side, which fortunately was a plot of undeveloped land within sight of my high school campus. I took a quick peek back over my shoulder to see if they were still in pursuit, but the car had sped off after I'd reached the top of the rubble pile and was now nowhere in sight. They had not parked in the lot at all. They had no business there. The driver was following me. I sprinted at top speed and didn't stop until I was soaked with sweat in the dead of winter and panting in the student lounge among my classmates, who didn't seem to give a damn when I told them. Possibly because our hometown supposedly is a human trafficking capital, and the crime rate is outrageous. Although I'm convinced that this was something more informal than human trafficking, as the dilapidated car suggested poverty, and I have read human trafficking usually arises through grooming and not being snatched off the streets. In retrospect, I should have told an adult, alerted campus security, and called the non-emergency line of the local police station. But I was young, foolish, insecure, and afraid of getting into trouble for leaving campus when I didn't have a signed permission form permitting me to do so. I kept trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation or was overreacting. I don't know what I would have even told the police had I called them, as I was entirely ignorant on the subject of cars, and couldn't have identified the make of it had I been asked, and I couldn't even see the faces of the occupants. I was also worried that my parents would restrict my already extremely limited freedoms if they knew I had been in any danger. I feel horrible for having never told anyone, and earnestly hope that my secrecy hasn't led to someone being hurt or killed. I believe the only missing people, aside from runaway children or elderly adults with dementia, in this city right now, though, are men, aside from one woman a few decades ago. So when I was a kid, My family was really close with the neighbours across the street. I was outside playing with the daughter when my parents told us they were going to run to the store for a bit. We asked them if we could stay at my house. I had a cool Barbie dream house, as her parents were home right across the street. My parents said yes and made sure to tell hers to keep an eye out. Once we were inside, we were thrilled to have the house to ourselves. Just like big kids, we made ourselves some lunch and watched cartoons for a bit, until there was a sudden knock at the door. Because of the urgency of the knock, I hopped up and ran to the door thinking it was my parents who'd forgot something. But after looking through the side window, I saw what looked like my friend's brother. I flung the door open, and there was a man who was not my friend's dorky 6-foot-tall brother. The man looked jumpy and told me he needed me to come outside because he had just hit my parents' car. I immediately panicked and asked which one. He took a few steps back to look at the driveway and said, "The red one. My mum's prized BMW." Now don't judge me too harshly. I was maybe 9 or 10, and someone had told me they'd just damaged the car my mum loved just as much, if not more, than us kids. I blurted out that my parents weren't home, and he told me he still needed me to come out to see the damages, because obviously a 9-year-old can assess the damages to a 1990s convertible BMW. I looked back at my friend, and while we chatted, he reached out to the open screen door. It was locked, but it was one of those crappy plastic ones that could have easily just been yanked a little and pulled open. But it wasn't until then that my alarm bells went off, and I told him I had to call my mum. He started to protest, but I slammed the door shut and immediately called my friend's mum. Thankfully, she's a pretty intimidating lady, and she marched right over before we could even finish explaining what was happening, and the man was obviously startled by someone getting there so quickly. When she demanded to know why he was at my door, he stammered something about selling magazines. Obviously, he didn't have anything with him, so she told him to get lost or she was calling the cops. It was at this point I looked out and noticed a car pull up, and he quickly hopped into it. I think we all came to the realization at the same time that someone had been in a car waiting for him at the top of my street. My friend's mum turned ghost white with recognition, then immediately red with anger. Let's just say we weren't allowed to be home alone for a long time after that. So this happened 10 years ago, and I still can't believe how lucky I was to get away. I'm a female and was 16 at the time, and running late for school as usual. It was around 9 a.m. on a weekday, as I was walking down the road, when I noticed a dark green car with tinted windows slowly following behind me. This was a residential area, so it wasn't unusual for people to drive slowly, so I naively figured that there was no danger as I hurried towards the bus stop. Arriving at the stop, it had just started to rain, so I decided to stand within the small glass shelter to wait. Standing there, I watched the creepy green car stop right in front of the bus stop, and the driver got out and approached me. Now this bus shelter was so small there was only room for 2 people. He stood in the entrance and grabbed each side of it, trapping me inside. He was very large and extremely intimidating, and something about his dead eyes sent chills through my entire body. He asked if I was familiar with the area, and I said that yes, I was. He asked if I was going to school. I said yes. He then asked if he could drive me to school so I could show him the way. Now call it intuition, but something in my head was screaming not to get in that car with him. I politely declined his offer and asked if he needed help with directions or something. Suddenly he lunged at me, grabbing my arm and pulling me out of the bus shelter towards his car. I started screaming as he kept insisting it would be faster to drive, and by the grace of God, the bus pulled up at this exact moment. All my instincts told me to fight, so I clawed at his face, kicked and bit him, and I contorted my body until he loosened his grip on my arm. Once free, I leapt onto the bus as though my life depended on it. The driver asked if I was okay, but I couldn't reply. I just ran to the back to find a seat and cried quietly in the corner as the bus drove me to school. All day I sat in class and said nothing about what had happened to me. However, when I got home from school, I told my parents what had happened, and they were horrified, especially after I'd showed them the bruises from the man's hand on my arm. We called the police and the officer arrived late that evening and took my statement. He said that there had been several similar incidents in the area and asked if I could come to the station and look at some pictures to identify the culprit. The following week, my mum and I headed to the police station, where the officer set us up with a computer to start scrolling through the mugshots. There were so many. Not only was it discouraging to realize how many known sex offenders there are close by, but after a while all the faces blurred together. Losing hope of identifying the guy, we were about to give up, when I suddenly was able to recognize his dead eyes in one of the pictures. The officers asked if I was sure, and I confirmed that it was him, but that he had grown a beard since the photo was taken. They thanked me and said they would call me if they needed to. 2 weeks later, the news announced that the police had apprehended the man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting young girls in the area. The news story included his mugshot, and it was the same man I had identified. He was caught with one of his underage victims in his car. It took years for the gravity of this incident to truly hit me. Had the bus arrived later, had I not been able to twist myself out of his grasp, or he'd grabbed me while I was walking and didn't see him coming, this could have turned out very differently. I was so fortunate, when others weren't. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.